Greetings, friends of liberty. I did want to apprise you of an interesting find that I happened upon recently while attending a small dinner party at the residence of Lord Richmond. I made sure to again indulge my habit as a bibliophile of wandering amongst the extensive stacks of his comprehensive library and manuscript collection, which can even be said, in certain subjects at least, to rival my own humble assortment. Idly leafing through the pages of a folio, I chanced to see its title, Learned Commendation of the Politique Laws of England, by King Henry VI's very own Lord Chancellor, Sir John Fortescue. Fortescue, travelling in exile with Henry in France in the 1460s, there set to paper the many differences he saw with French political life and his own. The form of his narrative is that of a dialogue, in which a barrister attempts to instruct a young prince about the almost innate, I should say, superiority of many English laws and customs. Amongst these he notes the high-handedness of the l'état c'est moi state, very much in contrast to our own, where even His Majesty is bound by the law. Our own methods of trial by jury, curiously absent in the land of cheese. See the extensive billeting of troops in French towns and villages, rendering these often destitute by their impositions and even depredations. And D, the levying of many and diverse taxes. All these insults, in combination, often drive the population to a state of the most frightful misery and want. Of course, in England, we largely have spared our population these financial indignities, with our greater respect for their property rights, and thus achieved a more prosperous citizenry and nation. And I would also be remiss in not mentioning, if we turn to your own 21st century, another author who's precisely focused on the differences between English historical practices protecting property rights and those of almost all other nations. I speak of that controversial hybrid intellectual, anthropologist and historian Alan Macfarlane, who in this potentially path-breaking work lays out what he believes to be the foundations for a radically different understanding, reinterpreting the extent to which we English have been much freer for much longer. If he's right, this would be yet another in the many examples of English exceptionalism. Macfarlane begins his book, The Origins of English Individualism, by recounting his previous attempts to understand the phenomenon of English witchcraft, while doing that research, noticing its differences between that of other countries. Unlike, for example, the Highland kilt wearers, who focused on alleged group sex with Satan, or the French with their incubi and succubi, not only were we English less perverted, less obsessed with sexual themes, but also more individualistic. In that, for example, the covens and group meetings were absent, and in England witches tended to act alone. After finishing this witchy research and publishing it as Witchcraft in Tudor and Stuart England, Macfarlane was moved to study the institution of English marriage, finding here too that kinship seemed relatively unimportant, marriage seemed to be little controlled by parents, and the relation between the sexes seemed unusually relaxed. All very modern traits. An additional study of diaries led to publishing the book The Family Life of Ralph Jocelyn, a 17th century clergyman, where yet again he was startled to find how modern his world was. His family life, attitudes towards children, and economic anxieties. He noted, too, that this general individualism was reflected in the concept of individual private property, in the political and legal liberty of the individual, and in the idea of the individual's direct communication with God. Given the relatively extensive legal and societal documentation found in England compared to other countries, he decided to try to follow the economic and political life of individuals and to examine in very considerable detail the history of ordinary English people. It is possible, for example, to follow the history of a village year by year for 5 or 6 centuries. With such an examination, perhaps able to resolve the issue of whether these members of the lower class were really peasants in the traditional sense, whose freedoms were curtailed as in Eastern Europe, or instead whether they possessed at least some of the freedoms and attitudes characteristic of members of much more modern societies. The first in-depth evidence he presents is of the aforementioned 17th century clergyman Ralph Joscelyn, whose diary reveals his own exclusive ownership of his land, warning to his son of being disinherited if he didn't shape up, very different from normal peasant societies where children's land rights are inalienable, and C, producing his farm produce primarily for the nearby market economy, not for his own use. In concluding here, Macfarlane agrees, however, Joscelyn is not a typical case, in that he was better educated than most, but adds there are many other diaries available, which often show the same behaviors and attitudes. When we turn next to other areas, we find that with regard to land sales, which would be highly infrequent in peasant societies, that in one English town of 274 pieces of property listed in rental in 1677, only 23 had been held by the same family some 2 generations earlier. We find a fully developed land market with the sale and mortgaging of land to non-kin. So the lower classes are renting or selling their properties to others just as we do today. Secondly, in that town, only about 1/3 of the people who had been baptized there died there. Such mobility is not frequent in peasant societies. Thirdly, he found increasing inequality of incomes as time went on, indicating that productive members were distinguishing themselves economically from those less productive. Fourthly, he found the great use of hiring, both of farm laborers and servants. Unlike in traditional peasant societies, with the family functioning as the unit of labor instead of the individual, this means that marriage and the first age of childbirth could be substantially delayed. In summary, the transfers in the manor court rolls, the deeds concerning freehold property, the lengthy cases from the village in chancery, and all other sources bearing on economic life in the parish suggest that by the later 16th century, ownership was highly individualized. As Macfarlane concludes, this all is a contrast with the classical peasantry. As regards the legal powers of women, so lacking rights in traditional peasant societies, here women could A, own land, B, move away from their communities of birth, and C, be hired as laborers or servants. All this indicated more relative freedom than a traditional peasant woman had, working with her family on the land. As Macfarlane says, in both Lupton and Killington, as elsewhere in England, women's property rights were extensive. Having documented instances of these differences in the protection of lower-class property rights, going back to the early 16th century, Macfarlane now turns his attention to consider the period between the Black Death and the end of the 15th century, particularly in terms of the central feature of the basic unit of ownership. In other words, is there evidence that this same extensive protection of property rights also occurred earlier? And he argues that yes, this was indeed the case, perhaps partly caused by the changes wrought by the enormous population loss due to the Black Death of 40 to 60%. A, in the court rolls of the 14th and 15th century, the old patterns of inheritance had been abandoned. And B, regarding the land sales, after 1350, the family's sense of inseparable association with a particular holding, which had been so marked a gesture of rural society in the early medieval ages, weakened. Indeed, in some places, it more or less disappeared. Macfarlane thus concludes, we have therefore pushed them, these types of property rights back from the 18th to the 13th century. Almost all our authorities agree that the peasantry had in practice vanished by the later 14th century. Wondering how far back he can go, he next looks even earlier, from 1200 to 1349. And he finds A, numerous customs which granted even small farmers great freedom of inheritance to not pass their land on to children or even a wife if they felt they weren't deserving. B, a great diversity of job types, in other words, occupational specialization, which doesn't much occur in peasant societies since families are relatively self-sufficient. C, again, the evidence of many land sales, with one researcher stating, at the end of the 12th and the early 13th centuries, land was frequently bought, sold, and leased by villeins without any recorded license from the lord. And finally, D, that women again, too, had relatively great freedom of action. As legal scholar F.W. Maitland commented, after the Norman conquest, the woman of full age who has no husband is in England a fully competent person for all the purposes of private law. She sues and is sued, seals bonds, and all without any guardian. Macfarlane finishes his presentation of evidence by again stating his thesis. What now seems clear is that England back to the 13th century was not based on either community or communities. It appears to have been an open, mobile, market-oriented, and highly centralized nation, different not merely in degree, but in kind from the peasantries of Eastern Europe and Asia, though only further research will prove whether this was the case. What our historian does subsequently is to look for historical commentators who might substantiate his claims further or add more context. Thus, he quotes de Tocqueville, writing in the 19th century, who says of England, "Is there any single country in Europe in which the national wealth is greater, private property is more extensive, more secure, more varied in character, society more settled and more wealthy?" He quotes Montesquieu, writing in the 18th century while visiting England, who said, "I am here in a country which hardly resembles the rest of Europe." He quotes a German author in the 16th century saying of farmers that the peasants dwell in small huts and pile up their produce out of doors in heaps and so high that you cannot see their houses. He quotes an Italian of the late 15th century who thought, "The riches of England are greater than those of any other country in Europe, as I have been told by one of the oldest and most experienced merchants, and also as I myself can vouch from what I have seen. Everyone who makes a tour in the island will soon become aware of this great wealth." Finally, Macfarlane mentions the comments of some modern historians. French historian Marc Bloch, for example, said, "Villeinage is in fact a specifically English institution. This is because, from at least the second half of the 12th century, the whole system of centralized royal justice and the common law set the English agrarian structure on a different course of development to that in France. As a result, the French serf of the 14th century and the English serf or villain of the same period belonged to two totally dissimilar classes." And the 19th century English historian Henry Maine said similarly that from the 13th century on, the great mass of English landed property had assumed certain characteristics which strongly distinguished it from the peasant property of the continent as it existed before it was affected by the French codes and as it is still found in some countries. So to conclude, my own feeling about Macfarlane's argument is that while I myself must be cautious here in not knowing enough of the details of English medieval life among the lower classes to really judge, his general argument is consistent with what we know. In contrast, so many traditional authors such as Karl Marx, Max Weber, and even historian Macaulay take the view that capitalism originated historically in the late 18th and 19th centuries. But this misconstrues effects with causes. The Industrial Revolution was an effect of having a society that already protected property rights more, as England did, at least to some degree. So any country, theoretically, will be more capitalistic the more it simply protects the property rights of its citizens. The technological level is irrelevant, meaning all the subsequent increase in productivity of whatever historical form it takes is a result of that protection of property rights. And so, if, as appears quite possible, Macfarlane's argument turns out to be true all the way back to the 13th century, it would not be surprising in the least. I should also mention that his subsequent book, The Culture of Capitalism, deals at length with the objections that some historians and anthropologists have raised. Very happy that, in 18th century England, as I have reminded them often, I have had the full right for perhaps half a millennium to disinherit my children if they prove too fractious. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.